We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi there, and welcome to this bonus episode of After America. I'm Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. And this week, as part of the Australia Institute's webinar series, I was lucky enough to have a chat with Nick Bryant. Nick, you might remember, was the first ever guest on After America. He's a former BBC foreign correspondent where he covered Washington, New York, South Asia and Australia. His latest book, released earlier this year, is called The Forever War. Nick and I caught up on the presidential debate, how gender and race is playing out this election cycle, what this might all mean for the rest of the world, and much more. I hope you enjoy hearing from Nick again just as much as I did. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Emma, it is fantastic. I'm watching that number of people tuning in and I'm just blown away by it. There are so many people who are fixated, I think, like us with this race and just want to keep talking about it and want to keep hearing about it. But it's great to have so many people join us for this discussion.
It sure is. And I think you're right. It's such a reflection of I think that the interest, the global interest in this election campaign, because instinctively, I think people know, how much of an impact it can have, not just on Australia, but on the rest of the world. I guess, Nick, we can't really get away from immediate events. And of course, we had that debate yesterday. You've been watching and writing about American politics and election campaigns for a long time. So why don't we start with, your take on the debate yesterday? What did you think of it?
Oh, Emma, ever since Donald Trump came down that golden escalator in 2015, I've been watching him in debates. I've watched every single minute of every single debate that he's ever taken part in, from those early exchanges with low-energy Jeb Bush and little Marco Rubio and lying Ted Cruz to the kind of presidential showdowns with Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. And frankly, I thought that Kamala Harris handled him better yesterday than any other candidate who has appeared on stage with him. I mean, she executed the game plan perfectly. At times, you could literally see her digging the elephant traps in the preamble to the points that she was making. But Trump, like this sort of lumbering giant, just kept on falling into them, didn't he? And they must have been absolutely delighted by that. Look, I don't think it was a flawless performance by any means. I think on the early question about the economy, I think, her team probably wouldn't have thought she got her message across quite as effectively as they would have hoped. But I thought from that second topic onwards, and the second topic, of course, was abortion, I just thought she really hit her stride. I thought Trump started making mistakes at that point. He spoke, for instance, about the genius of the Supreme Court justices, the 6 Supreme Court justices who had overturned Roe versus Wade. And I think that's the sort of clip that will come back to haunt you. And I think there were many clips from that campaign that will come back to haunt you. But of course, debates are a Rorschach's test, aren't they? You look at them and you see different things. And in a very divided America, a chronically divided America, people will have different takeaways depending on, whether they like Kamala Harris or they hate the prospect of her.
Yeah, of course. It was a kind of split screen of the two versions of America that, as you've written about, have kind of always been at war with each other, which hopefully is something we'll get into. But I just wanted to pick up on one of your observations there, because you mentioned the clips that will come out of the debate and how important they were. And it seemed to me that much of Harris's performance, especially her physical performance, the way that she used her face and her facial expressions to respond to Donald Trump, were kind of ready-made for social media. It was quite a masterful performance in that sense. And when a debate goes for 90 minutes and people are kind of tuning in and tuning out, and some people aren't watching at all, those clips become increasingly important. And it seems like Kamala Harris especially, that her campaign is oriented very much towards social media, often at the expense of the mainstream media. So I wonder what your take is on the role of social media, not just in the debate, but in the campaign, and how the two candidates are using it quite differently.
Yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right to say that not everybody watches 90 minutes of a debate. And even if you do, the on-the-night winner can often not look so good in the days afterwards when maybe something they've said is factually wrong. I mean, that's not such an issue in the Trump era, obviously. I always remember the debate between Al Gore and George W. Bush in 2000. It was only afterwards that we noticed that Al Gore had sort of harumphed and tutted and sighed his way through it. And that became the meme at a time when we were kind of starting to see the emergence of memes in an increasingly online polity. And yeah, often you don't really know the true winner until a couple of days later. Those clips have been played ad nauseum. Now, frankly, Trump had some decent clips. I mean, strangely, I thought his closing statement was effective. On the economy, if you have all these plans, why haven't you done them? You've been in power 3.5 years. I thought that was pretty effective. Presumably, that kind of clip will get replayed, especially on sort of sympathetic outlets like Fox News. But yeah, I mean, I think Kamala Harris clearly won the kind of meme war in the debate. And you make an interesting point about those facial expressions. I mean, that was one of the things that really hammered Joe Biden, wasn't it, in that first presidential debate? It wasn't only what he was saying, which was, incomprehensible at times. It was also his look when Trump was speaking. They had it in split screen, obviously, and he did look sort of dazed. He did look confused. He did look like a guy who had done his dash. And they always say you should watch the debate with the volume down to find out who's the winner. I always thought, I haven't got time to watch it as well with the volume down, but you do see those pictures emerged. And the pictures, I think, do convey the sense that this was a command performance from Kamala Harris. But as I said, I mean, some people have watched that command performance and hate the very notion of it, hate the very notion that a black woman was bossing a former president, Donald Trump.
Yeah, look, I think that's such an important point, and I think you could almost see at times Trump's struggle to take her seriously in that sense, and struggle to know how to respond to her, kind of given that context. And I think that leads to one of the very specific moments in the debate where Harris was asked about Trump's comments about her race, and particularly questioning whether she was black, and that Harris's response to that was particularly interesting, because she seemed to continue that theme of not focusing on herself as an individual, but focusing, flipping the focus back onto Trump and to the bigger racial context of what was going on there. So have you observed a change there as well in the conversation and the way people are responding to Trump's pretty bold and unvarnished racism? He doesn't hide it.
Yeah, up until now, Kamala Harris has kind of downplayed her race, hasn't she? She's tried to downplay her identity. She's tried to downplay her agenda. She's not making a big point about the historic nature of her candidacy. And Barack Obama did this in 2008 as well. I think it's often forgotten. People think about the race speech that he famously delivered. Do you remember when Jeremiah Wright, the pastor's sermons, came to light? But if you read the race speech, it was as much about the white side of his family as it was about the black side of his family. He was trying to sort of bring those two strands together, and he constantly de-emphasized race throughout his campaign. He left it to others really to talk that up. He didn't project himself as the extension of the civil rights movement, as Jesse Jackson had done when he ran in the 1980s. He didn't see himself as the torchbearer of the struggle for black equality. Kamala Harris is doing something similar this time round. It makes sense to do that. So I was interested that she did go into prosecutorial mode on the race question, and she detailed, didn't she, the long history of Donald Trump's racism, going back to the investigations into how, as a landlord, he was discriminated against African Americans. The famous advertisement that he put in the New York Times about the Central Park Five, his leadership of the birther movement, which obviously denied the very legitimacy of Barack Obama's presidency. And I thought that was interesting. I guess the Democrats are seeing the polling, which shows that young African-American men in particular are sort of drifting away from the party. They have always been such a traditional sort of bedrock of support for the Democrats since the days of FDR. And there are risks inherent, as you know, Emma, in raising the race issue, because that issue traditionally, since the civil rights era, has favored the Republicans. Nixon in '68 pursued what was called the Southern Strategy, exploiting white fears about black advance. The Southern Strategy came to be nationalized over the years. Reagan used it in 1980. George Herbert Walker Bush used it in 1988 with the Willie Horton Act. The Southern Strategy came to be nationalized, and then it came to be Trumpified. So there is a danger of raising race, because between 1968, as you know, and 1992, the Republicans had a virtual lock on the White House. And race, playing the race card, often from the bottom of the card, was one of the reasons for that.
Yeah, I think that's, of course, I agree with you. And it has been, I don't think interesting is the right word, but to watch Trump kind of toy with the idea of trying to appeal to black voters, and particularly young black men, as you say, and then kind of be dragged back to his kind of, I suppose, original position. And I think, I mean, I'm not sure about you, but it seemed to be fairly clear from Trump's performance in the debate that he was speaking almost exclusively to his base. He's rarely trying to appeal outside of that base. And I think you could even see that in the language that he was using. Some of his responses were really coded into the right-wing universe, into kind of Fox News language, that if you're not engaged in that space, you actually don't even necessarily have a handle on, which to grab in order to understand what's happening. So do you think that Trump is doubling down on that appeal to particularly a base of young white men? Is that the way, do you think the strategy is kind of unfolding in response to Harris?
Well, ever since he selected J.D. Vance, it seemed to suggest that he was going mega MAGA. J.D. Vance obviously has become very Trumpian after being a fierce Trump critic. He became a Trump impersonator. And I think now it almost seems like he has the zealotry of a convert when it comes to Trumpism. I mean, the thinking was he'd also help Trump in the Rust Belt. He doesn't come from Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, those three crucial Rust Belt states, but he does come from Ohio. And the makeup of that state is obviously similar, and the politics of that state is very similar. Ohio used to be a toss-up state, but it's become reliably Republican in recent times, although it has got one Democratic senator who's seeking re-election this year, Sherrod Brown. So they've gone mega MAGA. I think it would have made far more sense for Trump to appoint a woman. I mean, if they could have got Nikki Haley on the ticket, I think that would have been very strong. There are various reasons why Trump wouldn't have wanted to do that, not least that she went up against him in the Republican primary campaign and said some pretty strong things against him, which would have doubtlessly be replayed. But their tactic does seem to be sort of base maximization at the moment, and maybe that'll work. But there is this theory as well that they need to reach out to some of those sort of wavering Republicans who were Nikki Haley voters, who didn't like Trump last time round and voted for Joe Biden or didn't vote at all. And as we know, Emma, I mean, the male vote's a big thing, obviously, but more women vote than men. And often it is suburban women in those suburbs around cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh who tend to decide presidential elections. And given the importance of Pennsylvania this year, that could be even more important. So their strategy at the moment doesn't seem to be targeting them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, obviously. And Nick, I'm sorry, but I can't resist when you mentioned women voters, in particular, asking you about the Taylor Swift endorsement and whether, I, of course, was doing a lot of media around the debate yesterday as well, and just kept getting the question of, whether an endorsement from Taylor Swift even matters. Do we overstate the influence of celebrity on political outcomes in the United States? So I wonder what your take on the Swift endorsement is and whether it matters.
Well, look, a conventional wisdom has been emerging in recent sort of elections that any kind of endorsement doesn't really matter, whether it's a newspaper, whether it was a sort of politician, or whether it's a celebrity. And there was a thought that in 2016, actually, the kind of celebrities that came out in the final days, especially for Hillary Clinton, and she was holding these events in Philadelphia, I think, with Lady Gaga and Bruce Springsteen and all these kind of things. And there was this sense that hurt her, because it reinforced this sense of the kind of bi-coastal elites sort of gathering around her candidacy, and that she was this kind of establishment candidate that was, despised in many places around the country. But I think Taylor Swift's a different kettle of fish altogether, to be honest. I really do. You know, the Swift endorsement is what Joe Biden would call a big effing deal. It really is. And it's not just sort of mobilizing young women who Democratic insiders tell me are already sort of registering in huge numbers because of Roe, because of their fear about the threat that the Republicans pose to reproductive rights. But it's not just them, it's their mums as well. I mean, it's the mums that go on to Taylor Swift rallies as well. I was always struck covering Trump in 2016 that it wasn't just the MAGA diehards with their red caps and their faded jeans and their baggy t-shirts with Trump as the Terminator on it and all that kind of stuff. Trump dressed as Rambo. It was a lot of these mums who would take their daughters along, and often they were dressed in sort of Lululemon leggings. Often they were carrying their Starbucks, and they were these prosperous mums. And a lot of those prosperous mums are Swifties. I think this is a really significant moment. Obviously, the Democrats are desperate for Taylor Swift to come out, and I think it is a biggie. And I just think the timing was kind of interesting. I mean, if you're a Democratic strategist, you probably wouldn't have wanted to come out immediately after the debate. I mean, in a perfect campaign, you would want that maybe a few days later when she was getting good headlines last night anyway, so they didn't really need any more. But yeah, that's a really useful endorsement.
It is. I think you're right. And I think the timing of it was partly, this is me speculating, but Swift making sure that it didn't appear that she was working in concert with the Democrats, that she was doing it independently. And I think she was, because evidently it sort of took the Harris campaign by surprise.
Yeah.
And
I think you could argue that flat around because it did give an authenticity, didn't it, to the endorsement? It did make it feel like, yeah, she's done it. She's persuaded me. I'm all in. And that kind of, it felt kind of more spontaneous, didn't it? And yeah, maybe there's a kind of value in that.
Yeah, I wonder, and I think it will be really interesting to see if it does have an impact on registration, which, as you say, is already in amongst young women is already really high. And I've actually seen one study that suggests amongst young Black women in particular that voter registration is up. It's something like 175% on 2020, which gives you an idea of the kind of mobilization that we're talking about.
Amazing. And that's always been the most loyal Democratic constituency, African-American women, hasn't it? And and I mean, it's worth, Hillary Clinton had a problem in getting white women to vote for her. I mean, that was, she was obviously confronted with a massive amount of misogyny. But one of the problems that Hillary Clinton also had was persuading women to vote for her, white women especially. I mean, I often think that Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 election in 1992 when she had to introduce herself to the American people in the most appalling of circumstances. You remember that famous interview pre-Super Bowl, 60 Minutes. Bill Clinton's facing these barrage of allegations about his serial infidelity. They do this interview together. She says, I'm not just some Tammy Wynette standing by my man. Well, she really annoyed a lot of working class white women then. You remember Tammy Wynette came out immediately and sort of said, slammed Hillary Clinton. And a lot of people just never forgot that. And even after Access Hollywood, if you look at the kind of percentages that she was getting amongst white women with college degrees, it was still really surprisingly low. She only just beat Trump in that demographic. And after Access Hollywood, you'd have thought, well, maybe that would be 75, 80%. It wasn't. It was just extraordinary. So there is that kind of issue for Kamala Harris as well. So again, I think that really, the Taylor Swift endorsement really helps on that front.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, Nick, what you've just kind of outlined as well about Hillary Clinton's campaign kind of highlights one of the questions that has been looming over Harris's candidacy, which is one, I'm sure you get this all the time as well. I get it all the time. And the question is America ready for a Black woman president? And, often people will go back to Clinton and say, that's proof surely that America wasn't ready for a woman president. But of course, I don't think we can say that because of everything you've just outlined, particularly because of the political baggage going back at least to 1992 that Hillary Clinton brought with her. And I think the way that you've outlined the way race and gender plays into that kind of highlights how difficult that question is to
Yeah.
even begin to answer.
Yeah. Well,
So
just on the Hillary Clinton question, I think it's really interesting. Bill Clinton was a huge problem for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I mean, the economic decisions that Bill Clinton had made as president, you know, especially the deregulation of Wall Street, directly contributed to the subprime crisis and the Great Recession of 2008. So when Donald Trump said the American dream is dead, in the aftermath of that recession, a lot of people believed them, and in many ways, that was a kind of Bill Clinton recession. So that's one point. A lot of African Americans could not vote for Hillary Clinton because they'd been incarcerated. You know, Clinton's crime bill very much directed against African Americans to a certain extent. That was problem two. When Access Hollywood came out, Trump came out and said, you know what, I've heard Bill Clinton say worse things on the golf course. Now, I've got no idea whether that's true or not, but it's plausible. And that always made Access Hollywood for the Clinton campaign tougher to deal with. I also think that, you know, Clinton's presidency was so scandal prone that it kind of raised the bar about what would disqualify people to run for the presidency. And I think scandal became normalized. I think Clinton did something else as well, which was to reframe the question at the heart of scandal. It wasn't who do you believe, it's whose side are you on. They did that during the Lewinsky scandal, which we should have called the Clinton scandal. And Trump did that again in Access Hollywood. He said, you really want my Democratic tormentors to win over this? And that was a rallying moment for the Republican Party at a time when some people like Mike Pence were thinking of dropping off the ticket. So there's all sorts of reasons why Bill Clinton hurt her in 2016. Clinton also emphasized the gender aspect more, the historical first nature of a candidacy. You know, some people think that was a mistake. And there was another thing as well about Hillary in 2016 that was tricky, and it escapes me now. But I think the Clinton factor was so key. Oh, no, it's the big one. Sorry, it's the big one. She won 3 million more votes. I mean, she won the national vote by 3 million.
Yeah.
Ordinarily, that would translate into an electoral college victory. In 2016, it didn't, of course, and that was a bit of a surprise. So that, to me, proves that America's ready for a female president, no question. And if you look at the states, Emma, as you know, I mean, most, you know, the vast majority of states now have had female governors. I mean, there is a problem state, I think, which is Pennsylvania. Going back to Pennsylvania, it's never had a female governor. It's never had a female senator. And in its congressional delegation between 2015 and 2019, which was 20 strong, there wasn't a single woman. Now, I don't know whether Pennsylvania is unusually misogynistic, but if I was the Harris campaign, that would slightly worry me.
Yeah, it would. And I mean, I think you raised such an important point, Nick, about the popular vote, because we're facing down the same kind of situation again, where Harris may, the last calculation I saw, win the popular vote by significantly bigger margin than Hillary Clinton did, or even Joe Biden did in a victory. But it might end up being a state like Pennsylvania and all the baggage that comes with that, and, you know, a few thousand people potentially in Pennsylvania that makes the decision. So, you know, we have this arguably broken electoral system that Americans are dealing with. And in the debate, to go back to the debate, there was actually quite a bit of conversation about the state of American democracy, and the potential threat that Trump and Trumpism poses to American democracy in the way that it might kind of use that system against itself. And of course, you've written about this extensively, and January 6th and the ongoing threats to American democracy. So what did you make of that particular section of the debate? Because even in a 90-minute long debate, that section went for quite a long time, actually. They spent quite a bit of time talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, that was interesting as well, wasn't it? Because in the way that she's avoided race and gender so far, or downplayed those, she's also downplayed January the 6th. It's a point of differentiation, isn't it, between her campaign and Joe Biden's campaign. Joe Biden really made the defense of the democracy central to his appeal. I mean, he literally kicked off campaign year at Valley Forge, which was where George Washington's army sort of regrouped after some initial setbacks in the Revolutionary War. He keeps on going to these historical settings. You remember at the beginning of 2022, the midterms year, he delivered that speech in front of Independence Hall. that was kind of bathed in this sort of blood red floodlighting, wasn't it? It looked like a Halloween House of Horrors almost. But yeah, I mean, those historical settings were always about making this historical point that, you know, democracy was on the ballot. And Kamala Harris has not made that point anywhere near as strongly. She's tried to get onto the economic stuff. She's tried to sort of say, I'm a different candidate. She's tried to say, I'm the candidate about the future. It's time to sort of turn the page on the past, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it was interesting how she raised January the 6th. And it was kind of interesting how a kind of former prosecutor raised it in a kind of law and order manner, didn't it? The attacks on police officers and the attack on the on law and order, you know, trying to sort of take that away from the Republicans, which has been a traditional issue for them. So I thought that was quite clever how she kind of mounted a kind of two-prong attack on Trump for that. And of course, he went for it again. He kind of started defending, didn't he? These insurrectionists who many people regard as J6 martyrs, as they're now called. And, you know, Ashley Babbitt, he mentioned this Trump protester who was killed that day, who's almost been elevated. Well, she has been elevated in the MAGA world to martyr status. So yeah, again, I mean, she'd have been pretty happy with how he responded to all that, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think so. I think she would have been happy with a number of his responses,
Yeah.
and inability to not take the bait. I mentioned at the start, Nick, that we talk a bit about you know what this means for the rest of the world. And you've actually, if we stay on the theme of American democracy and the role it plays in the world, you've actually just written quite a long essay about Australian democracy and kind of outlined the ways in which Australian democracy is quite different, of course, to American democracy, but also how it isn't immune from the same kinds of forces that are undermining the integrity of American democratic systems and trust, importantly, the trust in those systems. So I wonder, are you worried about the impact that the kind of what looks to be the slow disintegration of American democracy might have here in Australia?
Yeah, look, I've been worried about the Trump effect ever since I came back to Australia, which was 3 years ago. It was in the middle of COVID. I was in a COVID quarantine hotel in the middle of Sydney for 2 weeks. On the first Saturday morning, Emma, I heard this roar from down below, the kind of muted roar of a crowd. And it was an anti-lockdown protest. And later on in the news, I turned on and they were carrying, some of them, Trump flags. Oh, this is interesting. This is kind of what I tried to escape from in leaving America. And here it is in Australia. And you remember that this became a real cool celeb, didn't it, for the American right? You had people like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, literally suggesting that America should sever diplomatic ties with Australia because of the severity of the lockdowns. You had, there's a famous sort of talk show host on American TV who suggested that America could actually invade Australia to liberate it. You know, you had Tucker Carlson saying things like, it's a shame that the gun laws came into play after Port Arthur because Australians don't have the arms to sort of withstand the tyranny of their own government. I mean, all this kind of crazy stuff. And then Donald Trump Jr. weighed in with his tweet saying, don't Australia my America. And I remember thinking, well, don't America my Australia. And I was kind of worried after that, you know, you did see some, I think it's become a bit of a cliche now, and I think the term is overused, but I do think there were signs of Trumpification. I mean, you know, I think you look at Scott Morrison's power grab, you know, that secret ministerial power grab that sort of defied the Westminster tradition. That seemed to me to sort of be a violation of a democratic norm. For instance, you had in the voice referendum, Peter Dutton questioning the integrity of the vote. And by implication, questioning the integrity of the Australian Electoral Commission. Now, that is the gold standard internationally of electoral commissions. And thank God Australia has it. America has nothing like that. As you know, the rules of elections are decided by the states and the counties, and there's no uniform system of voting. In some places, it's on computer. In other places, you pull levers. In other places, you sort of put a cross in a box. There's no kind of uniform suffrage. And these mechanisms are very handy. And another great safeguard of Australian democracy, of course, is compulsory voting. Now, I've done a complete 180 on this. I used to think that Australian compulsory voting was a little bit like rear to curb parking and all these other rules and regulations that you have. It seems a little bit overbearing, and people seem to be quite meek in their acquiescence of these rules. But it really is a useful safeguard against polarization. It means that elections are generally fought in the middle rather than the extremes, and election days themselves become these kind of civic celebrations in some ways. May the democracy sausage forever sizzle, maybe, and let's hope it remains as nourishing and succulent as ever. But you've got a good system here. And just to sort of say one final thing, I don't think Australians realise this necessarily, because I think there's a lot of lucky country thinking still. Donald Horne's book is 60 years old in December, and I think it still dominates thinking here. I mean, Horne's critique was not only that Australia had second-rate politicians; it had a second-rate system. Sorry, it had a second-hand system. It was too borrowed from the Brits, especially. I mean, look at Parliament. I mean, it looks like Westminster, right? You even have Hansard. You even have the green and red leather benches or whatever. And the nomenclature came from America, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So there's and Horne basically, I had this idea that basically Australia was this derivative country that couldn't come up with a system of its own, but it did. And it did very early on with compulsory voting, with preferential voting. Australia was the first country in the world where women could stand for parliament. There is this democratic tradition. It's not a good tradition in terms of its treatment of Indigenous Australians. That is a terrible sort of blight. But there has been a tradition of democratic innovation, and Australia has benefited from that, and it does to this day.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And a colleague of mine who's an expert in comparative democracies has described Australia's democracy as truly exceptional in the world. I think, which is a kind of nice
If you're looking for
claiming of
Australian
American mantle.
exceptionalism, I mean, Australian democracy is a good place to start. Yeah.
It is, and I think we underestimate that, the positive impact that we can have on the world with that model. More often than not, we see kind of what happens in America in particular as something that just kind of affects us, that we have no influence or agency over. Which is partly, of course, because the United States is the most powerful and influential country in the world, which brings me probably to what might be my last question before we go to questions from the audience. Because there was actually, the Harris campaign before this debate kind of said they wanted it to be about policy. They didn't want it to be about the kind of personality politics that we've become so accustomed to. And kind of, I'm not sure about you, but I was kind of surprised with how much policy discussion there actually was in this debate. And one of the areas that they focused on quite a bit was, of course, national security. And you mentioned in one of your earlier responses how differently Harris is speaking about law and order and the military in particular. So I wonder, did we get more of an indication of how a potential Harris administration would treat national security and what that might mean for the rest of the world, what it might mean for the role America plays in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Harris isn't the Cold War warrior that Joe Biden is. I don't think there is that kind of doctrinal belief in the alliance system, the post-war alliance system that has been the bedrock, really, of American preeminence since World War II. But I mean, clearly she believes in it very strongly, believes in going up against tyranny, believes in going up against totalitarianism. I mean, that was one of the key lines of difference that she was trying to draw, wasn't it? With Trump going weak at the knees for these strongmen like Putin and Xi Jinping, and Kamala Harris speaking, very traditional sort of democratic sense, what pre-Trump would have been a pretty traditional Republican sense as well. Sounding pretty hawkish on that kind of stuff. So I mean that obviously is a clear difference. I mean, Trump on Ukraine, obviously not saying what the war that he's promising to end in 24 hours, how that war would come to an end. I mean, presumably with major territorial concessions to Russia, or possibly even a green light for him to advance on Kyiv. I mean, who knows? I mean, J.D. Vance as well has doubled down on I don't care about Ukraine. So there's a stark difference on foreign policy, and in broad terms, Kamala Harris represents a kind of internationalist tradition, and Donald Trump represents what's also been there in American history, which is an isolationist strand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. We've talked about this a little bit before, because I'm not sure if Trump is isolationist. There's this sense that he would kind of withdraw especially, you mentioned Ukraine, but he also has this kind of belligerent approach to international relations that would involve kind of stomping all over alliances, which I think is not necessarily isolationism so much as just a different way and a more aggressive way of exercising American power. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, yeah, I do think the American First does sort of tap into a kind of isolationist. Trump makes great virtue of the fact that he didn't start any new wars, for instance, and he's tried to withdraw American forces. When it comes to foreign policy, I mean, he's so hard to predict. I mean, I heard Trump, must have been about 5 or 6 years ago to this day, or 7 years ago at the United Nations. It's Hunger Week soon, isn't it? And he threatened to basically wipe North Korea off the map. Now, I was with him on the Korean Peninsula a couple of years later, and he's having this kind of bromance with Kim Jong-un in the DMZ, and he's stepping foot into North Korea. So, Trump's hard to sort of predict on the international front. I mean, look, he literally sort of ordered strikes against Iran, didn't he? And then called them back. So it's it's really difficult to predict what, in foreign policy terms, a Trump second term would look like.
Thank you so much for joining us on this little bonus episode of After America. My chat with Nick was recorded on Thursday, the 12th of September, and a bunch of stuff will probably have happened since then. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd be super grateful if you subscribed on your podcast platform of choice. You can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter @the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. And we'll be back to regular programming next Tuesday, when you can hear from very special guest Terry Givens, who's a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. Until then, I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.